Hello and welcome to the Imprint Weekly Podcast. I'm John Kelly, Senior Editor of The Imprint, a daily news site covering child welfare and youth justice around the country. You can read all of our coverage at imprintnews.org or check us out on Facebook or Twitter at @TheImprintNews. You can also sign up on our homepage for our free weekly and monthly newsletters. And for professionals in child welfare and youth justice, subscribe to our Youth Services Insider section for a closer look at news on business policy and practice. The Imprint Weekly Podcast is also a member of the Safe Camp Audio Network. You can check out our show page and all of Safe Camp's other great podcasts at safecampaudio.org on the web or at safecampaudio on social media. I hope everybody had a lovely holiday season and New Year's, and I want to thank anyone who listens to this show and donated to the Imprint and our parent organization fostering media connections. During the past 2 months while we did the News Match campaign, we were well past our match goal of $50,000, which is huge for us. Since we were off for the holiday last week, I'm going to run through headlines this week, and we're going to start where we left off in 2025 with quite a bit of child welfare and family policy news coming out of Washington, D.C., after which I will recap some more Imprint headlines from around the country and a few other interesting things that happened around the holidays. Let's start with a home for every child, which if you heard my colleague Michael Fitzgerald's interview with Alex Adams, who is Trump's top official on child welfare and on family support, he runs the Administration for Children and Families, which is part of the Department of Health and Human Services. A home for every child is the North Star goal of sorts for the administration. And more specifically, that goal is to end his term, President Trump's term in 2028, with a 1-to-1 ratio of foster homes to children in foster care, which can, of course, be achieved in two directions. You could have more homes, you could have less kids in foster care, or you could achieve it through a combination of both. So in mid-December, in an offer that Alex Adams first announced in the Imprint publicly, Adams wrote that he hopes to steer at least some states towards joining him and the administration in this home for every child goal by having them opt to work with the administration on regularly tracking and setting specific goals around foster care capacity and other things that kind of hew to this 1-to-1 ratio. And the sweetener to get states to kind of buy in and work with them on this 1-to-1 ratio, as he offers this up in the op-ed that we published, is to let them do that, to work with the administration instead of the more laborious and often criticized process of program improvement plans that stem from states' failure to pass their periodic federal child welfare service reviews, which they all do. They all failed. Not one state has passed a federal child welfare services review in the entire time that they've existed. So it's a fairly clever enticement, less bureaucratic work in exchange for joining the Home for Every Child bandwagon. I heard from one former state official, they couldn't really see a reason why it's not a better deal on some level for the states, except maybe for apprehension around whether this sounds great now, but then the next presidential administration comes in, starts dinging people for not having worked on their program improvement plans, which will not go away. I don't think that's, at least thus far, not something that the administration has taken action on. So we'll see. It'll be interesting to see whether states take them up on that. Now, as the administration has indicated, the home part of this equation is kind of a dark spot in federal data. And that's sort of what they're trying to get at by getting states to more regularly report on things like how many total licensed homes and kids in care that they have, as opposed to just having some of that, not all of it, come out every year. But as the administration has indicated, the home part is really a dark spot, and the Imprint's Who Cares project is really the best thing going at this point. We are very close to wrapping up our full data collection for the Who Cares project with states now for their 2025 numbers, and we will be getting that up on the project website soon. That includes things like the total number of licensed foster homes that states have, how many of those homes are non-relative, how many active relative caregivers each state has, the number of congregate care providers they work with, and a count of kids who are in foster care. And we peg all of this in our project to the end of March of a given year, or as close as states can get to that. Anyway, so the full set, I'm really hoping will be up sometime this month, if not absolutely in February on our site, which is fostercarecapacity.com. In the meantime, sort of just so I had something to end the year with our 2025 numbers, I put together some data for the total licensed foster homes piece at the end of 2025. And then I used 2024 federal numbers on youth and foster care to sort of set up the ratio that Adams has kind of put in place with this home for every child thing. I'll drop a link in the show notes for that. You can see, because I just sort of laid it out in a simple chart, state by state, the number of homes, the number of kids, and then the ratio of those two things. Just to tell you what it shows, in those 45 states, we were able to make a comparison in thus far. And I do hope and expect that we will be able to get the information for all 50 states this month. But in the 45 states, we were able to get data from, by the end of last year, the total number of homes identified is 166,510. And when you compare that to the same 45 states in 2023, so just 2 years back, that is a 9.7% decrease from the 2023 total, which was 184,533. How about going back a little bit before COVID? Going back to 2019, the year previous to COVID, we can compare 44 states from 2019 to 2025, because Virginia didn't respond to our 2019 request and they did respond to the 2025 request. So in those 44 states where we can compare between 2019 and 2025, there has been an 18% decline in the number of licensed homes from 2019 to 2025. So the trend is down in the number of licensed foster homes, but at the same time, the number of kids is dropping as well. And so what the ratio shows when you sort of bang together our 2025 licensed home numbers with the 2024 data, which is the most recent sort of official data on youth and foster care, what you find is that the ratio they're trying to change and achieve that one-to-one ratio, that has been pretty sticky since 2019. In 2019, the ratio nationally was 0.56. In 2023, the ratio was 0.57. And in 2025, that ratio with homes to children was 0.55. So pretty sticky, not a lot of change there. The administration's goal is to get to that one-to-one. There, as far as I could tell, in those three collection periods, there were only 2 states that had achieved something in the order of one-to-one. Idaho, which Alex Adams ran for a little bit more than a year as a child welfare director, is one of them. And then Vermont had a year in there in which they achieved a one-to-one ratio. So that full set of our Who Cares foster care capacity data will be soon available on fostercarecapacity.com. And we will definitely dedicate an episode of this podcast to talking about that once we get it all together. Might have some exciting news on that front too. We're kind of early in the process, but might be sharing a lot of our numbers from the project with some researchers who can probably go a little deeper than we ever did on everything we've collected since 2017 when this whole Who Cares project began. So that's the Home for Every Child update. Meanwhile, you might have seen some reporting out of Minnesota about the child care fraud scandal there, which, among other things, basically prompted Governor Tim Walz to drop out of the gubernatorial race. He was planning to seek a third term. Much less attention, though, has been paid to the fact that in the wake of that, the Administration for Children and Families, which Adams oversees, attempted to freeze a slew of financial assistance programs in a handful of states, including payments for the Temporary Assistance for Needy Families program, the Social Services Block Grant, and for some allotment of child care assistance. And Minnesota was one of those states, but it was not the only one. It also included California, Colorado, Illinois, and New York. I'm not going to go in depth on this one because my colleagues did a great job reporting on it last week. Go to the show notes, read their stories. The nuts and bolts here, letters to these states suggest that a primary driver here is the administration's suspicion that in these states, undocumented immigrants are receiving support through those programs. In the specified states, there's been a lawsuit challenging this freeze, and a judge has halted the freeze on TANF and SSBG money as a result for the time being. And then since then, in another move that appears to be related to immigration concerns, the Department of Agriculture has frozen SNAP benefits in Minnesota and is demanding that the state's 4 largest counties recertify everyone before it gets unfrozen, which I think would be quite a lot of work and would take a lot of time, meaning a lot of people would be without eligibility for SNAP benefits, meaning they're not getting food, and would require basically people to like physically come in and re-register for SNAP and go through the approval again. Who knows where that will be in court? I am sure it's already been legally challenged. Maybe it's even been blocked by the time that you hear this. We will continue to report on all of the sort of social safety net and family support programs that are being put in limbo in some states by the administration. Going back to before the holidays, the administration canceled several child welfare related grants that it had decided were focused primarily on diversity, equity, and inclusion, which on the first day of this administration, Trump made clear via executive order that he planned to root out the federal government. I had definitely heard from one of the grantees impacted here way back in January of 2025 that they hoped for the best, but had expected something like this to happen at some point. You can read our full write-up for some more details on who all got canceled and for how much money, but the basics here. There were 32 grants on December 8th, according to the database that the federal government keeps, 32 grants to 11 organizations working on projects that it has determined no longer, quote, effectuate the program goals or agency priorities. Those 32 grants total up to $34.9 million, and the grantees collectively had about $13.6 million remaining on those grants. So 34.9 million total. Looks like about a little more than half of that money had been spent. Again, we did a whole write-up kind of breaking down who lost this money and for what. You can check that out at Youth Services Insider. I'll drop a link into the show notes. Last two things on the White House watch front. Before the holidays, the Administration for Children and Families sent a letter to 39 states asking them to stop the practice of using survivor benefits paid out to children who are in foster care for child welfare services. I'm just quoting from the press release. ACF has notified all 39 governors who allow this practice and aims to work with states to end it. The goal is to ensure these earned benefits are no longer taken from foster youth and are instead preserved to support them as they transition out of care. So this is an issue we definitely knew action was coming on. You had Alex Adams sending a letter to states kind of early on in his tenure after he got confirmed, basically saying, I'm here to work with you. I'd like to work with you, except on the practice of taking survivor benefits into child welfare, general operations. In his interview with R. Michael Fitzgerald, Adams indicated that this was a move. This had just basically happened really the day that Fitzgerald interviewed him, that he would try to employ the use of honey before he used the vinegar. And so this is sort of like a first salvo to see if he could convince governors to just kind of simply stop it. But I wouldn't be surprised if the response is lackluster on that they wouldn't take some actions to kind of try and stem it at the federal level. And finally, in news that the imprint broke last week, the Trump administration has tapped Ryan Hanlon to lead the Children's Bureau. So while Adams is the top child welfare official, he oversees ACF, which we just talked about, which actually does much more than just the funds and policy on foster care and prevention, et cetera. They do family support and all kinds of other things. Children's Bureau is the division within ACF that's actually older than ACF, and it directly manages, child welfare financing and policy and research and all that. Hanlon is the former president and CEO of the Virginia-based National Council for Adoption. He had worked with the organization since 2017, and before that, he served as executive director of America World Adoption, which is an agency that provides domestic and international adoption services. Hanlon makes the leap here from relatively small nonprofit management to overseeing a very large federal bureaucracy, though I guess it is smaller than it was last year because of the actions taken early in Trump's administration by DOGE. Hanlon goes from a portfolio also that was very rooted in adoption of all kinds, though, from foster care, private, domestic adoptions, and then, the ever-shrinking number of international adoptions taking place in the United States. Although I think that little portfolio is managed by the Department of State. I don't think Children's Bureau has much to do with that, actually. So he goes from that to a position where adoption is just one of many aspects. And going back as far as I can remember, this job has been held either in the interim by a federal employee or a civil servant, or by somebody who has been in child welfare leadership on some level of government. Maybe a listener can correct me if I'm wrong there. I don't know for sure that it has always been held by somebody who's sort of been in government and sort of run at least the county level system. My read is that the choice of Hanlon is a signal that in the emerging platform of the administration, supporting adoption as a path to permanency is going to be front and center. And as the past few years of federal data shows through AFCARS, the number of adoptions from foster care hit its peak before the pandemic. It has declined sharply since then, as have the number of kids who might be adopted, because there has also been a steep drop in the number of terminations of parental rights. And those typically come hand in hand with kids moving towards adoption, although many of those youth do not actually end up being adopted. Also, in President Trump's executive order on foster care, which was announced in November at the White House, there is inclusion specifically of instructions for the Department of Health and Human Services to work on what they call maximizing partnerships with Americans of faith, and sort of delineates that they should do that both by increasing partnerships with faith-based organizations and by implementing policies that shield providers and people from being precluded from participating in child welfare because of their religious or really any other beliefs. Hanlon certainly has experience working with faith-based organizations from his career thus far, so I do think that was certainly a point in his favor as they were trying to figure out who to put in this job. All right, we will take a quick break, and then we'll be back with some more headlines.
Are you a professional in the field of child welfare, juvenile justice, or other family and youth services? Subscribe today to Youth Services Insider, the imprint's exclusive section on all the insider news you need to stay in the know. Funding opportunities, major federal and state policy shifts, interviews with key leaders in the field. It's all available only for our Youth Services Insider subscribers. Sign up for a monthly or yearly subscription today by visiting imprintnews.org/subscribe. Our podcast listeners get 10% off their subscription by entering the promo code podcast10. That's imprintnews.org/subscribe and get 10% off your subscription by entering the promo code podcast10 today.
Let's go through a couple of non-imprint headlines that are somewhat connected. One is a piece of recently published research about the connection between foster care removals and child maltreatment fatalities. And then the second is a recent debate on the appropriate level of intervention by Child Protective Services, which was hosted in New York City and was broadcast live on YouTube. So the research, which was published publicly in JAMA, looked at 3.4 million child welfare records from all states between 2010 and 2023. That is a period of time that saw the overall number of youth in foster care first drop pretty considerably, then spike significantly, and then decline again. And of interest to the researchers here was looking at the rate of entries to foster care per 1,000 kids, and then the number of child fatalities due to child abuse or neglect per 100,000 in the child population. And on that latter metric, the researchers acknowledge what pretty much everybody does, that due to variations in how states assess and track deaths, the universe captured in federal records is likely an undercount of those maltreatment fatalities. And from those records, which when you just start parse it out, amount to, I think it says, a cumulative 700 years of individual state data. And I'm going to quote from the study here. What they found was no evidence was found of a negative association between state year level foster care entry rates and state year level child maltreatment mortality rates. That child maltreatment mortality rates did not appear to decrease with higher foster care entry rates or increase with decreasing foster care entry rates. So they're very clear in noting that this is a finding of association and not causation. It is also not remotely supportive, is me talking now in and of itself, of the idea that foster care is useless in preventing specific maltreatment fatalities. It is obviously true that an unknowable amount of children were not killed because they entered foster care, and that some amount of children have been killed because they were not removed from foster care. This is research that, in the estimation of its authors, calls into question the notion that the recent decline in the use of foster care, which began in 2017, continues today, is the reason for the increase recently in child maltreatment fatalities. And I'll drop a link to the study in the show notes. It is free on the JAMA network, which is not always the case. So I'm very happy for that. So I'll drop a link. Not a very long study, so pretty easy to read. Now, the debate I referenced was held by the SOHO Forum in New York City, and it's on a topic kind of closely hews to what that research was trying to get at. The resolution on the table at this forum was government-run child protective services should intervene more in the lives of children. Arguing in the affirmative was Naomi Schaefer-Riley of the American Enterprise Institute, or AEI. And in the negative was Martin Guggenheim, who is the Fiorello LaGuardia Professor of Clinical Law Emeritus at the New York University, and I believe still is a co-director for its Family Defense Clinic. So the way it works at SOHO Forum, which I had never seen before, but it was kind of a cool venue and concept, is the audience registers what side of the resolution they are on before the debate begins. And then at the end, another vote is recorded. And the winner of the debate is the person whose side of this resolution picks up the most support between the pre and post vote. I'll post the link for where to watch it, as this was held live and recorded and published on YouTube by Reason TV. A good chunk of the 2 hours is questions from the audience to the debaters, and that certainly got spicy at times. The winner, as defined by the rules, was Riley. Overall, even after the debate, more voters in the audience chose the other side, but her position saw the net increase in support from before and after. Just to summarize the arguments you would hear, though I definitely think it's worth watching for yourself, Riley defined the terms pretty precisely, saying, and this is kind of early on in her argument, government does not need to intervene in the lives of more children. It needs to intervene more in the lives of children who are already being reported. And then she lays out her argument that there are driving ideological forces, societal forces that she believes are misguided, that dissuade systems from intervening more in those children's lives. Guggenheim built the negative around a more macro level argument about government, and that the track, specifically, his argument was that the track record of government in the lives of poor people, especially non-white poor people, is bad when it comes to protecting their health, keeping them safe, and helping them out of poverty. And so, he argues, while acknowledging that some children do need to be removed from their homes for their safety, the government should be as little involved as possible. It is worth a watch, in my opinion, because there are advocates of both progressive and conservative persuasions at this point who believe that when it comes to child safety, more power and money, which are two things that almost always go hand in hand, should be moved into the hands of community-led efforts and out of the structure of government agencies that have the power to separate families. Certainly, you have seen that in New York City, which is where this debate took place, but you've also seen it in the recent America First Policy Institute paper that we discussed before the holidays, which is called Reclaiming Foster Care, an America First Vision for Protecting Children and Strengthening Families. The author of that document, Brandon Logan, argues for the creation of community care compacts as a means to achieve this, which he explains is a form of alliance between, churches, nonprofits, civic organizations that assume a primary responsibility for child protection in their regions. So the role of community was not front and center in this debate, but certainly you can see where the debate over the appropriate level of intervention for government plays into that, because the absence of government intervention does not imply that there would be no intervention. The question becomes who would, if not government, right, to some extent. So anyway, we'll drop the link on YouTube to check that out. Okay, home stretch here. I'm just going to note some imprint coverage recommendations from kind of late November on into early January. First, reporter Jordan Anderson spent November and December very diligently covering a pretty eventful end to the year in Georgia, where the state abruptly started to gatekeep a bunch of child welfare services and even halted a few of its contracts with providers. Now, initially, this was attributed to the federal government shutdown that ended in November, and it is true that Georgia uses a disproportionately high amount of its temporary assistance for needy families money on child welfare services, whereas some states use those TANF money to actually provide more income support to low-income families, or they'll use it for other services. Georgia really relies on its TANF dollars to pay for a big portion of child welfare services. But the limits stayed in place even after the shutdown ended, as it became clear that the Child Welfare Agency in Georgia had a bigger budget gap than just what could be temporarily attributed to the shutdown. I'm going to drop a link to Anderson's most recent story on the saga, which covers an all-day legislative session that pretty much wrapped up 2025 in Georgia. It was a joint session between the House Appropriations Committee and the Human Resources and Judiciary Juvenile Committee, where legislators heard from some of the impacted providers who had seen these services get kept from the state level or had contracts canceled. And they also heard from the state's child welfare director, Candace Brose. In her first public appearance since the budget crisis kind of became public knowledge, she delivered a 30-minute long statement to explain some of the issues causing the crisis. And she pointed to the proliferation of children coming into custody with very acute mental health needs and the skyrocketing costs, those her words, skyrocketing, associated with caring for them. One of her comments to the legislators, the most simplistic explanation is that we have more expensive children on our caseloads, and we do not have full control over managing those costs. It will be a very interesting one to continue to follow in Georgia, but I also think it's possible this kind of portends some similar issues elsewhere. I mean, obviously, this kind of started or kicked off with the shutdown, and it probably did play into what happened. But I think the rise in costs probably due in some part to inflation from the past several years. At the same time that states are kind of seeing some downward shifts in federal support for things like Medicaid and SNAP coming down the roads, I think it's going to be kind of an interesting legislative season in terms of where child welfare budgets are marked. In New York, reporter Sushanti Sarkar reported on the official signing by Governor Kathy Hochul of two pieces of legislation that Sarkar had been covering all year for us. The first one is a bill that has actually been vetoed a few times before and is now law, and it would end the acceptance of anonymous reports by the statewide Central Register of Child Abuse and Maltreatment. That is the hotline for the entire state that receives all the reports of maltreatment and routes them to counties for investigation. The vast majority of child welfare systems around the country do accept anonymous reports. New York becomes the second state, along with Texas, to curb it entirely. California also passed a confidential reporting law in 2024 that requires all callers to provide their names and phone numbers, but with the assurance that their information won't be disclosed. The law in New York requires callers to leave their names and contact information, making reports to the hotline. Now, if they refuse to do that, no formal investigation will occur. The hotline staff are instructed to instead direct callers to the state's Here's line, which is set up to connect families to services, supportive services such as like housing, childcare, things like that. And then the other bill that Hochul signed was one that essentially seeks to ban the practice of providing trash bags, garbage bags to foster youth to move their belongings. And New York joins Texas, Maryland, and Oregon, which have already barred those practices. Although the New York bill passed the legislature unanimously, the advocates who pushed for it are a little unhappy with the amendments that were made by the governor's office. The sort of initial vision for this was that the state, through its Office of Children and Family Services, would provide the funding necessary to ensure that kids had luggage and appropriate baggage instead of, trash bags to move their stuff around, and that the counties would have to report to the state on, essentially guaranteeing that they were doing that as an accountability metric. I know Texas has implemented something like that as well. Instead, due to the amendments, the responsibility is going to fall on these local social service departments to provide suitcases, and there isn't a reporting process required under the law. Next up, from reporter Jeremy Loudenbeck out in California, there are now 11,745 youth aged 20 or younger in Los Angeles County's foster care system, and that compares to 21,637 in 2020. So there was an enormous decline, and Loudenbeck explored the various policy-driven and societal reasons behind such an enormous drop in the single largest local child welfare system in this country. Among other people, Loudenbeck interviewed Brandon Nichols, who is the director of the Department of Children and Family Services in Los Angeles, for this story. He attributed the drop to better social work and to, quote, getting to the root, end quote, of family dysfunction that causes harm to families. Quoting further from Nichols, "My personal North Star is if there's any way for a child to be safe with their family, that's what we need to be striving for. The data shows we're going in the right direction." The last news story I want to recommend here is one by our Indigenous Children and Families reporter, Nancy Marie Spears, who profiled Three Precious Miracles, which was an organization started by Elisa and Tecumseh Manuel as a resource closet for Native foster youth and their caregivers. It has evolved over the years. I think they've been around for more than 10 years now, to much more than that in that decade. Now they are a robust nonprofit providing much more support and cultural connections for those groups in Arizona. Here is a description from Spear's story. After 11 years of operation, Manuel said her organization has helped thousands of Indigenous children by providing foster parents with essentials like diapers and clothes. Her mission is to help Native foster parents in Arizona who need assistance and non-Native foster parents seeking to connect the kids in their care to their tribal cultures. To that end, Three Precious Miracles provides free workshops for parents and children where participants learn how to sew ribbon skirts, bead, make pottery, and more. It's a nice story. And a final recommendation, not an article, but something from our opinion section, actually, and it's by Sarah Winograd of Together with Families, which is an organization in Georgia that works with caregivers in the state to provide support in times of crisis in the hopes of preventing family separations. Now, Winograd has, for nearly a year now, been writing a series for our opinion section called Crisis Confidential, in which she has each month been describing a single case that Together with Families acted on, with details about exactly how the organization worked to get the family the help they needed to avoid a foster care removal. It's not entirely an opinion section or an op-ed, but I appreciate her working with us on it because I thought it would be a good way to kind of explore the nuts and bolts of how kind of like a small sort of mom and pop level organization gets in the weeds with families to prevent foster care when they can. They have all been really interesting, and we have a few more coming in 2026 to sort of round that series out. But for the final one in 2025, which we published just before Christmas, Winograd agreed to sort of step back from the usual pieces and reflect overall on the lessons learned by her and others Together with Families in its first full year as a standalone nonprofit. They've been at it for more than that time, but this is really that kind of first year they've been an intact, on their own organization out there in the world and what they've learned about how to sort of work effectively in this space. So just a teaser from this piece, which I thought was really well written. The work is not done for families. It is done with them through partnership, guidance, and sometimes hard truths. Families are connected to the organization the same way the broader community is, as contributors, leaders, and problem solvers. The belief is simple. Everyone needs help sometimes, and everyone can help. Past participants become some of the strongest leaders. Parents, relatives, and youth who once received support later help design programs, mentor others, lead groups, and build community. That continuity changed the culture. The work stopped being just about support and became shared ownership. That's going to do it for us for this week. The Imprint Weekly Podcast is a production of the Safe Camp Audio Network, which is a division of Fostering Media Connections. Please visit safecampaudio.org on the web or at SafeCampAudio on all major social media. This podcast is produced and mixed by Christine Anjoko with music by Luke Giroux and Cyrus Elliott. If you enjoyed this episode, we would love it if you would consider subscribing or giving us a 5-star rating on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you download your podcasts. And we would greatly appreciate if you consider supporting our work here on the podcast and in print. Small donations from our listeners and readers go a long way towards helping us grow and cover more great stories in child welfare and youth justice. To support us, it is very easy. Just visit imprintnews.org/donate. You can follow The Imprint on Twitter and Facebook by searching the handle @TheImprintNews, and you can visit us on the web at imprintnews.org. You can reach us on email at tips@imprintnews.org. I'm John Kelly, and we'll see you next week.